Circular Industry Talks. And a special welcome to Francesco De Fazio, who will take care of today's presentation. Francesco is a senior sustainability design engineer at Accenture, formerly known as Van Berlo. I'm not sure if the name still is used, but you might maybe tell us, Francesco. He is especially interested in designing for a circular economy and methods and tools to enable that. And today, Francesco will talk about the Circular Electronics Design Guide, which is a comprehensive resource guiding practitioners in the electronics sector. This is created by many experts from also many organizations. So, Francesco, please tell us.
Yeah, thank you, Ruth. I'll try to share my screen. Yes, yeah, I hope you can see the presentation now. So, yes. Hi, everyone. As briefly mentioned by Ruth, I'm going to present today about the Circular Electronics Design Guide. This is a very big piece of work that we have been working on this year with many different organizations. For today, I thought that it would be interesting maybe to start with some introduction indeed about maybe me and also indeed Accenture Industry X Industrial Design, formerly known as Van Berlo, and also to give a bit of background about how this initiative came to life, because it involved a lot of different organizations, leading organizations in this industry, which I think is what made this entire guide the special outcome that it is. So very briefly about me, I'm Francesco. I'm a senior sustainable design engineer at Accenture Industry X Industrial Design. I'm an alumni from TU Delft, so Ruth was my teacher a few years back. I'm also part of the co-organizing team of the Circular Design Forum. I've been studying at TU Delft, and after that I worked at Philips for some years as a circular design engineer, and now I'm part of Accenture. So always working on this topic for the past 5-6 years. Very briefly about Accenture Industry X Industrial Design. This is a multidisciplinary group that brings together people with very different type of backgrounds, from traditional industrial designers to engineers, strategists, and researchers. We always try to bring together these different expertises in the work we do for different companies. We are based in Eindhoven, in the south of the Netherlands. That's where we have our main industrial design center. And then we also have a studio in Ypenburg, close to The Hague. We are, of course, part of the bigger Accenture group that, of course, has a global footprint as well. We are part of the Accenture engineering competence called Industry X. Our group specifically focuses on the front-end product design and innovation part of the design process. So we work a lot on value proposition creation, concept development, proof of concepts, prototyping, testing, and then we team up with other part of the Industry X group for instance, industrialization and creating, for instance, design ready for production and launch. The group has more than 40 years of experience on design and innovation. As briefly mentioned before, Accenture Industry X Industrial Design was formerly Van Berlo, and now fully transitioned to Accenture. We work with many different type of clients and products and industry, from like consumer electronics, but also industrial equipment, packaging. And this usually is what also the companies we work with appreciate the most, because then sometimes we can bring learnings from different industries to another industry, and that sometimes helps developing new solutions and looking at the same challenges from different perspectives. Accenture is a very big organization. There are a lot of different capabilities that are now focusing on the topic of sustainability. Our specific group focuses on sustainable product innovation. So we look at the topic of sustainability from the product perspective, and of course from a physical but also digital element as well. And just to give you a brief idea of the type of work we do from product journey mapping, value chain mapping, life cycle assessment, product design and engineering. We actually published almost 3 years ago an extensive guide where we documented also some of the design methods and approaches that we use in our projects. We call this approach the Sustainable North Star, and this is also another asset that I would encourage you to have a look at, since it captures a lot of knowledge that is available for free online. But enough about us. Going back to the Circular Electronics Design Guide, as mentioned, I would like to give a little bit of background about how this initiative came to life and all the amazing organizations that have been working behind this deliverable, this very valuable asset now available for free for anybody. So Accenture is part of the Circular Electronics Partnership. This is a coordination platform hosted by WBCSD. It brings together more than 35 leading organizations from the electronics industry. You can see some names also on these slides. And the goal of this coordination platform is to coordinate the efforts that these different companies have been working in isolation on related to circularity in such a way that we set up, create projects where these different companies come together and collaborate so that they coordinate their efforts to accelerate the transition to a circular economy. More specifically, what that means is that the CEP defined what has been called the Circular Electronics Roadmap. This roadmap describes a holistic approach to guide this industry-level transition towards circularity. There are 6 specific pathways that have been defined as part of this work, one of which is designed for circularity, acknowledging the importance of starting to capture the knowledge that different companies have been developing in isolation on this topic in documents and assets that can be used for educational purposes as well, to share this knowledge beyond the 4 walls of specific companies and enable this industry-wide transition towards circularity. Another important initiative that has been behind this work is the Circular Design Forum. This is a cross-company knowledge sharing initiative, which we initiated 2 years ago. It now brings together more than 180 experts from 35 different organizations. And these experts come together in monthly sharing sessions, similar to the one of today, to share with each other way of working, approaches, learnings, on how they approach different topics related to circular design. What we did was to propose to the organization, part of either groups, so the CEP and the CDF, to join forces and to write a guide on circular design for the electronics industry by capturing one single document the insights, learning, practices, way of working of practitioners coming from different organizations. Just to give you a brief idea about how massive also this work has been, eventually 25 organizations joined the work group that developed this document. More than 60 experts from these 25 organizations directly contributed to the guide. Eventually, this was a huge amount of information that we captured in quite an extensive document of more than 600 pages, and all of this was done in 9 months. We officially kicked off this initiative in February of 2024, and we officially released the guide at the Circular Design Forum Annual Summit of 2024 during Dutch Design Week. So when we started concepting this guide, we really tried to ponder on the meaning of mastering circular design. What were we trying to achieve with this guide? What was the goal of this guide? And for many of us that have been working on this topic for the past years, mastering circular design means something very specific, and that is going wide. There are so many topic, expertise areas, capabilities that you must at least be aware of if you want to implement circular design correctly, from regulations, materials, logistics, life cycle assessment, user research, business cases, and way more. At the same time, what we also realize is that just being aware of all these different expertises aspects, but in a superficial way, doesn't allow you to develop pragmatic solutions and really develop design solutions that can be truly implemented. There is this second dimension of mastering circular design that is going deep. And the combination of the two, going wide, at least being aware of a lot of different topics and expertise areas, and going deep enough in many of them to be able to correctly implement the topic, is what makes circular design so challenging. What we often hear from people that are just approaching, starting to learn about circular design, but also from practitioners that have been working on this topic for a long time, is often that it feels overwhelming. It's very hard to really keep up to speed with a lot of different things that are constantly going on. For instance, new regulations or also new technology advancement, for instance, on topics like recycling, but also repair. So for this guide, we set a clear goal to ourselves, a guide that goes both wide, so that covers these different shades of circular design, all these different topics and elements that someone must at least be aware of to design for circularity, but also going deep enough into many of these areas of expertise, deep enough at least to provide insights that don't just give a general idea about the topic, but also provide actionable insights that can help someone implement this topic in their everyday work. A guide that also helps navigating the complexity of this topic by providing a sort of structure, a way of looking at, again, the application of circular design from end to end. So we could have definitely not done this alone because, again, this topic is so wide and that even for us, we for sure were not experienced enough on all the topic to really write a in-depth guide on all of them. So what we did was to bring together this work group composed again by these 60 experts coming from many different organizations, from manufacturers, recyclers, universities like also TU Delft, and also people and experts with very different backgrounds. We had people, of course, with product design and engineering background, but we also had many people that instead had a background, for instance, in life cycle assessment or data analysis, sustainability managers. And this diversity really helped us to capture the wideness of this topic, but still going deep into the different areas. What we did was to focus on capturing actionable insights. What we mean with this is we really tried to strive to capture not generic considerations on the topic that we believe are already well captured in many documents available already, but really to capture more actionable, pragmatic insights, a way of working, practices that practitioners in these different organizations are adopting to implement this topic. And the way we did it was, for instance, one-to-one expert interviews, but also surveys with the bigger group and also focus group where we addressed one topic with a bigger audience. We also always like to highlight that this document should not be seen as a scientific publication. It's not based on an extensive literature research. You should look at this guide as a document that captures the often personal beliefs, opinions, experiences of practitioners coming from leading organizations, right? So still really reliable sources, but still personal beliefs. And oftentimes what you're also going to find in the guide, we try to capture also contradictive or opposing views on the same topic. We really tried to cherish that because we thought it was extremely insightful to see how different companies sometimes might approach the same topic in a very different way. But what is circular design? What do we consider with this wording as part of this guide? For those of you that are already familiar with the topic of circular design, you already know that circular design goes way beyond product. It's also about designing services and also industrial systems. In this guide, we pushed the definition of circularity also beyond these 3 layers by considering also designing what we called the enabling foundation. This means those enabling conditions that are necessary to enable an organization-wide shift towards circularity. For instance, designing a circular culture, circular governance, circular data schemes. What we did was to try to capture these differentiates, applications, roles that design can play in enabling circularity through what we call the circular innovation process. And this process is a very holistic end-to-end process composed by 4 main phases, starting by the enable phase, that is about designing, again, those enabling conditions that allow for organization-wide shift. So, for instance, designing a circular culture, governance, data schemes. Frame, that is about creating a clear, common, and shared understanding of circularity across an entire organization, across different business units, across different departments, to enable, for instance, an orchestrated approach towards circularity that is orchestrated across different business units and departments, for instance, by designing frameworks, metrics, KPIs, and targets. Plan, that is about designing new circular value propositions, to design value propositions where we combine circular models with also exploring which one are those that fit also with the business needs and ensure profitability for the business. And finally, implement, that is perhaps the phase that most people associate directly with the word circular design. Here we talk about implementing the new circular value proposition, for instance, through circular product design, circular operations design. We often feel that operations design is something often neglected when talking about circular design, but also user engagement design and communication design. But how to capture this complexity? Like in one slide, I mentioned so many different things and aspects, and you can deep dive in each of these a lot. Our answers to that has been creating a map, a visual representation that aims to bring a bit of clarity, a structure on how this process actually look like. And this brings us to this is the level 1, we call it blueprint. This visualization of the circular innovation process, where you can recognize the 4 main phases that I just mentioned: enable, frame, plan, and implement, and then key sub-phases of these 4 macro steps of the process. The way we look at this blueprint is as these are 3-dimensional block of knowledge with a small door that you can open, and you can walk down the stairs and you can get deeper and deeper and deeper into these blocks of knowledge, all the way down to really pragmatic information on how to design a circular design framework, how to design a circular value proposition, how to design for repair. And if you do so, if you open this block of knowledge and you expand them, you get to a deeper level blueprint where we try to detail out step-by-step best practices, approaches about how to design for the different topics that are addressed in this process. So what we usually like to do when we present this guide is to show the guide itself rather than slides describing the guide. So I would like to share with you the document itself, and also maybe starting by some considerations that might help you navigating it as well. So the Circular Electronics Design Guide is a PDF document. What we try to do is to embed as much interactiveness as we could within the limits of a PDF. This because, again, this document is quite extensive. We don't expect the majority of people to read 600 pages all at once, but of course you are definitely welcome to do so. The way we would like you to look at this document is as a knowledge bank that is always there for you to selectively read, depending on what type of topic you want to deep dive in a certain moment in time. So let's say in a specific moment you need specific information on how to design for repair, you can directly jump to that section. In another moment, you might want to know more about data schemes for circularity, and you can read that section in that moment in time. So throughout the guide, on any page of it, you're always going to find a button that is going to allow you to go back to the main table of content. Through this table of content, you're going to be able to jump to the main sections of the guide. Something that I always like to highlight is that there is a very useful executive summary section that perhaps is the best starting point for you to familiarize with the different parts of the guide, understand what type of content you are going to find in each of the section of the guide, and perhaps this can inform you on which part might be the most relevant for you to start from. Another interesting thing that we already received a lot of positive feedback on because it really helped with navigating the document is a reading guide as part of the introduction chapter. Here, what we try to do is to indicate which chapters of the guide might be the most relevant for you depending on your role. At the same time, I always strongly encourage people to read also parts that might not directly relate to your role. So I always give the example, if I'm a senior sustainability manager in a company and I'm asked to create a circular design framework, for me, there is a huge value in reading the section of the guide that deep dives into the challenges and opportunities of implementing refurbishment. In that way, I can use that information to inform my higher level, company level circular design framework. At the same time, let's say I'm a mechanical engineer. I've been trying to push from my role for repairability for years, and somehow I always received a lot of pushback from different stakeholders, and I always didn't understand why there was so much pushback. It might be interesting for me to read about the enable section, the enabling foundation that perhaps is not fully mature yet in my organization. The guide is split in two main parts, part 1 and part 2. Part 1 describes those more overarching considerations and insights that are not specific to a specific phase of the circular innovation process. So, for instance, you are going to find the first chapter of part 1 that is describing this overall circular innovation process, the 4 main phases that I also briefly described today. The second chapter of this part 1 is about transition, designing transition. The blueprint describes the best practices coming from leading organizations in the field. So it's unthinkable for an organization to implement all these best practices overnight. So we really wanted to make sure that we would give enough space and focus in this guide to the topic of transitioning. How do we transition from a linear way of working to a circular one? So what we try to capture in this chapter is anecdotes, insights from the experts from all these organizations on ways that they found being successful to help transitioning. And we look at transition from 3 different levels, from an organization transition to an offering level transition to an industrial ecosystem transition. To show you a sneak peek of what you can find in the guide itself. For instance, I always like the section on the offering transition. Here we captured anecdotes, for instance, shared by companies like Microsoft, Versuni, HP, on ways that they found to scale over time some of their offerings, for instance, on repair and refurbishment, starting from B2B, that this company found to be a lower hanging fruit, something easier to tackle first, to develop initial capabilities and expertise on the topic of repair, for instance, and then over time shifting towards B2C, so going towards consumer repair, and how this transitional approach really helped them to get more and more buy-in from leadership, showing that this new offering would actually work, would bring benefits, and then scaling it up over time. Another interesting thing maybe to mention about transition is that we also looked into how these different transition can also interact with each other. So for instance, some companies mentioned, for instance, Philips, have been put a lot of effort in setting up a very structured and solid overarching circular design framework and strategy. And then they use this to cascade it down in the different business units. Other companies instead used a more bottom-up approach. They start from an offering level transition. For instance, they did multiple pilots testing of new value proposition, for instance, refurbishment. They looked into what worked, what didn't work for their business, and then they used this learning to feed their company level strategy on the topic. So again, as already mentioned, you're going to find that many times different companies use different approaches, and we found it very interesting. Part 2 instead is a much more operational part of the guide. What I mean with that is that here we really focus on capturing the how to design for. So here you are going to find a much more pragmatic type of informations and knowledge captured. So part 2 is really structured by following the circular innovation process and the blueprint that I showed you earlier. The enable chapter, again, is about designing those enabling conditions to allow an organization-wide shift towards circularity. We deep dive into circular governance, circular cultures, and data schemes. I can maybe show you about data schemes, which is something that for me, like coming really from core product design, is something that I didn't have a deep knowledge in. I can also maybe use this section to show you the type of information that you are going to find in this guide. You're going to find things like this one. These are not assets we design it. These are assets that have been offered by the companies themselves. Oftentimes, these are assets that have never been publicly released before. These are internal tools, documentations. What you're also going to find everywhere around the guide is this type of visual elements. We call them expert pieces. In this guide, we really try to give the stage to the experts that contributed to it. They are the protagonists of the guide. And this also helped to really showcase and to present this knowledge in the right way. So again, this is not a universal truth. This is the experience of this specific expert within this specific context in this company. So for instance, here you can see an expert piece from AWS, Amazon, together with Accenture, and how they develop an automated circular data lake that they use to surface data that then they use to inform their bigger circular strategy and also to inform their circular design decision-making. Frame is the part of the process that is about creating this common and shared understanding of circular design across business units and departments to, again, allow for this orchestrated approach, company-level approach towards circular design. Here I can maybe show you about circular design framework creation. This chapter is extremely interesting in my opinion because we captured different approaches that different companies used to achieve the same thing, the framework, but doing it by considering the different business contexts of different companies. So the type of information you're going to find again in the guide are very pragmatic. For instance, here we try to capture in a very concise way what type of input information many companies mention they use to create their framework. For instance, specific standard family like the Sense Enelec standard family, specific on the topic of circular design, different art strategies, or a very recent new ISO standard family that many companies mention have been using as a reference in their frameworks. And again, to show you the diversity of assets that you're going to find in this guide. You can see, for instance, anecdotes shared by Schneider Electric about how they created their framework, from Philips, how they approach it, creating the same exact thing, but from their perspective. Philips shared also more detailed assets about internal reference frameworks they developed to drive the topic across different business units and departments. We also had interaction with Danfoss. Again, you can see same exact thing, framework, but structured and organized in very different ways. Then follows, for instance, deep dive into how they connected this framework to 30 overarching design guidelines, and then how these design guidelines have been connected to an internal circular design calculation tool that they use to also monitor the implementation of circular design in their company. Philips have deep dived into how they translate the framework into targets and KPIs and how they differentiate these targets for different businesses. We then have Plan. Plan, again, is about defining a new circular value proposition for your company. What we also deep dive into is what we call context research. What we mean with context research is all those type of activities that help you to capture information about your baseline design, your current context, your current proposition, your user, that is essential to inform a new value proposition. This can mean, for instance, user research, lifecycle assessment, circular product assessment. And if we go, for instance, in context research, you're going to see that we also tackle the topic of doing it at product level or portfolio level. We heard a lot from different companies. Some companies prefer to do this for each product category. Some companies explain this is not efficient for us. We really want to try to drive the topic at portfolio level. At the product level, context research, you're going to find some interesting anecdotes, for instance, from Fairphone about how they integrated fairness in their circular value proposition, but also detailed information from Adam from HMD on how they validated with consumers new offerings, new value propositions, for instance, on consumer repair for their smartphones lineup in different regions and nations as well, and the differences that they encountered depending on different geographies. Finally, the last section of the guide is the implement section. This section is about implementing the new circular value proposition. Here we touch on a lot of different topics related to implementation, from how to set up targets and requirements, how to implement different R strategies. What we did here was to prioritize and focus on 3 specific R strategies. We decided to do so to make sure that we would have enough time to go deep enough into each of these. So we prioritized the 3 R strategies that we believe are extremely relevant for the electronics industry, including repair, refurbishment, and recycling. But we also touch on topics like how to design communication and user engagement, for instance, to push behavior change, adopting new value propositions, new utilization models, and also monitoring. Monitoring is such a huge topic right now, also because of new regulations, CSRD, and a lot of new reporting structures. It's extremely important for a company to set up monitoring system to make sure that implementation is happening in the right way. So what I can do is maybe to show you something about these 3 R strategies: repair, refurbishment, and recycling. I can also use this section to show you how we structure the document. As you might have already noticed, we created a sort of layered approach where you have different tables of contents. And this approach allows you to always have a clear understanding of what the new section you are accessing is going to be about. So if I go back to the main index, you see that I went into the implement section. Now let's say I want to deep dive into the topic of repair. And here I'm asked, do you want to deep dive into the topic of designing operations for repair or designing product for repair? Let's say I want to deep dive into the topic of product design for repair. And then you see a final table of content that again gives me at one glance an overview of the topics that are going to be found in that section. What you are going to find at the beginning of any of these chapters, from the macro to the micro, is always a concise overview of the key insights that you're going to find in that section, so that if you don't have the time to really read the entire chapter, you can at least have an overview of the most important insights that are captured. And what we also did was to always show a section of the blueprint where you are in that specific part of the guide. So for instance, this is a zoomed in the blueprint level 2 on the topic of product design for repair, where you see represented a step-by-step approach to design for repair that has been created based on the best practices shared by the different companies. If I go through this chapter, for instance, on repair, we start by talking about priority parts definitions, best practices, guidance information on how to define what priority parts are. You're going to find insights, anecdotes, for instance, from Fairphone about how they collected failure data when they introduced a new product category. This is something that we often hear companies struggling with. If you have a product that you have been designing for 40 years, you have a huge amount of historical data that you can use to define your priority parts for repair. If you're introducing something completely new on the market, what data are you going to use? We also created reference overviews that can help someone understanding if we design for repair for in-factory versus authorized service provider versus independent service provider versus end consumers. There are very different considerations that you have to keep in mind. We also deep dive, of course, into the topic of modularity with very interesting consideration from Microsoft and Fairphone about how they define which modules should be modular and what is the level of modularity, with pros and cons coming with modularity, for instance, modularity overhead. We, of course, deep dive into the topic of disassembly, which is definitely something that most people associate immediately with repair, with a lot of pieces also coming from TU Delft on how to mechanically design for repair. But we also deep dive into other topics that sometimes don't immediately come to mind when thinking about repair. For instance, how to tackle in-field parts calibration if we are designing for the end consumer to repair. This is a very key challenge for consumer repair. And topics like design for diagnostics. Without diagnostics, there is no repair happening. Refurbishment, I can maybe show you a different perspective. So at the level of operations design rather than product design. Here we deep dive into, for instance, how to design a refurbishment protocol. And again, you can see detailed assets that have never been shared before by company like Versuni that shared some sneak peek overviews of the type of protocols they developed for the refurbishment of their home appliances. And we described also how a refurbishment protocol and operation looks like. And also, again, all these visuals, pictures you see here, this is not stuff we downloaded from internet. These are really pictures of the refurbishment operations of these different companies, including Versuni, ERI, that is a big IT asset disposition company in the US. Detailed consideration about how to track a refurbished product. This is extremely important for quality control. And also how to pilot and scale a refurbishment operation over time. Finally, I can conclude, maybe show you something about recycling. Recycling, we deep dive a lot on this topic with many different companies, including Microsoft has been working a lot on design for recycling, but also Philips and Pezzi that have been running EU-funded projects on design for and from recycling. Here, what we did was to capture a generic recycling treatment scenario that you can use to guide your design for recycling. Here, again, combining insights from different organizations and what they learn from different recyclers about how their recycling of e-waste works. We also describe in detail how this process looks like. And then we really dive into specific guidelines on, for instance, what polymers to use, what polymers are a bit borderline, where sometimes they are recycled in some geographies, sometimes they are not, and what instead to completely avoid. And we also deep dive with Microsoft in the topic of how to assess recyclability. Microsoft has been doing an extensive research together with Unitar to collect primary data on recycling rates of different materials to have very detailed and reliable recycling rate calculations for their product categories. So I could go on for a long time talking about the guide, but I think probably we are also going a bit over time. As you can see, I hope that this demo gave you a bit of an idea of how broad this guide goes, but also how deep it goes. And as already mentioned, the guide is completely available for free on the CEP website, CEP 2030. So please have a look, download, use it. And we always love to hear feedback and also hear if this document actually helped you in your everyday work or not. So please feel free to reach out with any inputs you have. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesco. Very impressive collection of methods, tools, approaches in a I would say, very comprehensive guide. Might be hard to think where to start with asking questions, but who of the audience would like to kick off?
May I start?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Francesco. This is Neeraj Chandelier from TNO, and this is the first time that I'm joining these sustainability talks. So thanks a lot, Elisa, also for inviting me. A wonderful talk. And I'm really impressed by their 3D model where you are advocating to go wide and go deeper and thinking in the 3D terms and showing that blueprint. Now, I have two questions. So first is about this blueprint itself. So you show the implementation to be the last step. What I'm wondering about is the loop going back. So for example, the lessons learned during the implementation, does the blueprint allow you to refine your approach accordingly? So it's not a linear, but rather a circular approach, again, in the blueprint. And my second question is about the complexity of the supply chains. Now you talk about the electronic sector, but I'm wondering about several other industrial sectors where you have such a complex, and even in the electronic sector, you have such a complex supply chain where you have several geographic locations distributed all over the world, and achieving such a circularity in such a complex supply chain. How limited is it as per your experience? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your question, Nirai. I think they are both pretty relevant. So I can maybe share my screen again. I think I'm sharing the wrong screen. Yes. So for sure, like what we always say is that as soon as you have a design process that you represent in a linear way, you are automatically making a simplification, because any design process works in a very iterative way, and there is never something that really looks like going from A to point B. What we tried to do was to represent in this blueprint how there is these monitoring steps that we believe is really the key to actually have a feedback loop of information that feed back to two important steps. First of all, your circular framework. So making sure that, for instance, what you learn from implementation, you use it to refine your understanding, company level understanding of circularity, and also your KPIs, metrics, and targets. And the other feedback loop that we believe is extremely important is in what we call implementation plan and roadmap. So after you design a circular value proposition, usually you start going into a phase where you start detailing out a sort of a multi-year implementation plan. Most circular design value propositions cannot be implemented in 1 or 2 years. You need to think at least 5 years ahead. And everything that you learn from, for instance, first pilots and testing, you use them to inform and adapt this implementation plan over time. So I would always be cautious of seeing this as a sort of simplification effort to give a sort of understanding of this very complex topic. But being a complex topic and this being a simple representation, there is, of course, a lot of simplification happening. And I would always be mindful of that. What about different geographies and supply chain? complexity. So the second question, I think for sure, is a huge challenge on supply chain, especially because oftentimes there is not one company that is doing everything, right? It's not like you have Microsoft, and Microsoft is developing from their chips all the way down to shipping their products out. There is a huge network of suppliers and sub-OEMs. So what we heard from many companies is that everybody's struggling with that. If you have strong circular ambition as manufacturer, but then they are not reflected in your supply chain, then there is very little you can do. So there are companies that, of course, have more leverage on pushing on their suppliers to adopt more circular behavior. So let's say, if you are Microsoft, for instance, you have enough lever to push some of your suppliers to also start adopting some strategies that fit and that are important to enable your strategy. If you are a smaller company, then it can become more tricky. At the level of geographies, what we learned is that many companies prefer to start from one specific geography and then expand over time. So, for instance, we learn from multiple companies that, for instance, on refurbishment, Versuni, that is ex-Philips domestic appliances, they wanted to start exploring refurbishment. What they did was to run some initial consumer studies. They identified DACH, so Germany, Switzerland, Austria, as one of the most interesting markets to start piloting this new offering, because there was quite some interest there for refurbished products. So they didn't try to set up an entire plan, a global plan at first. They just started from Germany. They ran pilots, they captured learnings, they set it up first small scale operations, and then they started to scale over time. And what they are doing is trying to fill out the entire European map and also explore beyond Europe as well, but they are doing it in a gradual way. We heard from other companies instead that they are exploring going global immediately. And what the benefit of that is economy of scale. If you start from one single geography, then also the amount of products, for instance, returns volumes and return product is smaller, of course. If you go global, then you have access to a much bigger amount of products that can make the operations more easily profitable because you have economy of scale. Another important thing that I would also consider is the issues of regulations in different nations. So applying, let's say, refurbishment in Germany looks very different compared to applying refurbishment in Spain. Some nations don't allow refurbishment or allow refurbishment only of some products. So it's very hard to just say, okay, we are now doing refurbishment at global level, because every time you need to learn how to apply it at local level as well.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Hello.
Thank you, Ruud. Francesco, what a wonderful guide. Thank you for this very comprehensive work. I think there's a lot of details in there that could really help me out in doing my research. I haven't gone over through all the 600 pages yet. So I have a question for you. Maybe it's not in there, but maybe it is. Is there something about design for automated disassembly in there? Because what we find at our Smart Sustainable Manufacturing Research Group at the Hague University of Applied Science is, if it isn't automated, then often you need to use a very high-paid staff to actually disassemble products if you're busy with refurbishing.
Yeah, so I think that, thanks a lot for the question, Aboy. I think it's a great point. I don't think we addressed this topic in the guide, but I think it's definitely an interesting topic that could be addressed also in future version of the guide as well. The reason why is because the truth is that what we understood, at least from the companies that were part of the work group, is that this is not a common practice yet. So it's definitely something that makes a lot of sense, but it's something that is simply not a commonly applied way of working. So what we hear is that still a lot of repair, refurbishment work is done in a manual way. And of course, what that means is that you have that sort of threshold below which, if your retail price is lower than that threshold, then automatically it's very hard to justify either repair or refurbishment, because you have the labor cost that oftentimes, for instance, has to happen in Europe or in the US. And then it's very difficult to justify that cost. So I definitely believe that automation can help lowering that bar and starting to tackle lower and lower end products as well. What we heard at the same time also from, for instance, Versuni, is that they are finding ways to be able to optimize more and more their manual operations as well through very smart refurbishment protocols and very smart process lines.
Francesco, this brings me to an additional question. Bit building upon this one. This is an area of research. I know various research groups diving into this. Your guide is really, say, based on current company methods and tools.
Mm-hmm.
This brings the challenge of keeping it up to date. And what plans do you have there?
Yeah, so the goal is for sure to keep expanding and updating the guide over time. So also, for instance, for the future, the CEP and also the members of the CEP already expressed huge interest in keep growing and expanding the guide and updating over time. I still believe that it's true that a lot of things are happening and at really fast pace, because this topic just, I think, in the past 5 years, you really saw how it started from not being a priority at all and now being on everybody's agenda. At the same time, there are some things that I think require a systemic type of change that I think is definitely gonna require, let's say, a multi-year time frame. So I see also a lot of work going on new recycling technologies, which of course is amazing, but you can imagine the time frame that is going to take for an entire, for instance, recycling industry to adopt these practices. So although I think there is a lot of change that hopefully is going to happen soon, I still believe that it's going to take maybe 3-4 years before the type of information in the guide are going to be completely outdated.
Okay, any further questions? I have another one, and that's actually related to the fact that you have very specific company information related to quite specific context. What is the level of expertise that people in other companies would need to really dive into this and be able to adapt it to their specific conditions?
Well, I think that what we have also been talking a lot about also between our group is that the biggest bulk of the work, in our opinion, is also on the strategy side. When you start going into the engineering side of the topic, oftentimes you can heavily rely on the current expertise that is within a company. So when we do also work on engineering for any company, we always really try to immediately involve as soon as possible the engineering group of the company itself, right? So let's say we do a project for a company that produces laptop. They have a huge R&D of amazing engineers that knows everything about how to design a laptop. And then what we can bring is a new perspective, new way of thinking, but eventually they already have all the technical knowledge required to develop solutions. So I believe that although at the strategy level, defining what the priority should be and what to start from first and what after, that's perhaps the part that companies really need to bring new expertise within their organization for. For the implementation part, companies can often heavily rely on the huge amount of historical knowledge and expertise they already have on design and engineering. And then, of course, you need to bring that different perspective on board. But I think that there is so much in this guide that any company could start implementing even without having a very strong sustainability structure or department or expert group between. But of course, you start needing also new roles and expertises. We see it happening everywhere if you really want to drive this topic forward at company level wide.
Okay, thank you. We are nearing 11 o'clock, so to the closure of this meeting, Francesco, once again, thanks for this impressive piece of work. And you started with a disclaimer that it is not a scientific source, but I'm quite convinced that it also will be a source for scientists, as it is a really very rich document. I would like to thank all attendants for joining this meeting and asking some questions to Francesco, and I hope to see you also next time. Thanks, Francesco.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thanks to you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.